Hey. All right. So we have everyone here. Shall we get started? All right. No false starts this time. Great. Okay. So hello and welcome to the Rafaël Retrospective Conversation Series with Artists and Curators. My name is Elizabeth Sweet, and I'm the communications lead at Rafaël. Today, we're here to talk about digital art versus NFT art. Now, before we get into it, I want to give a bit of context for why we're here. Now, from June 28th to July 12th, Rafaël is celebrating 2 years as a gallery in what we're calling the Retrospective. And 2 exhibitions take center stage. We have The Experiment and Rafaël 1.0. Now, The Experiment is a reflection on A2P, which stands for Artists to Peer. It was a project curated by Casey Reas, Silva, Addie Wagenknecht, and exonemo, in which artists were asked to create an artwork and swap with each other over the course of a week. We didn't have the language at the time, but these were NFTs. And that was 2019. Now, the model and spirit of A2P served as the foundation of Rafaël, which opened its first exhibition in May 2021 with Social Codes, curated by Rafaël co-founder Casey Reas. And since then, Rafaël has hosted 33 exhibitions with curators and artists from across the digital art landscape. Each exhibition begins with a distinct curatorial vision that together help tell the story of digital art in the 21st century. Now, The Experiment reflects on A2P, spotlighting 19 artists and artwork from the 2019 project. And Rafaël 1.0 is the celebration of all 33 exhibitions, featuring one artwork from each. Curated by Casey Reas, Rafaël 1.0 encompasses the breadth and depth of artists and artwork featured in the gallery. Now, over the last few days, we've had 3 talks with established artists featured in both exhibitions, who in the last 2 years have gone on to make even bigger waves in the digital art discourse and Web3 spaces. And these 3 talks have been environments, bodies, and generative art. I encourage you to listen to them. And for right now, you can find them on our Twitter, but soon we'll upload them to YouTube and they'll be a little bit more accessible and findable. You don't have to search in that. Search the bird, as they say. So today, we're here to talk about digital art versus NFT art. And my interest in having this conversation actually came from a discussion I was having with Peter Burr in New York City a few weeks ago about the potential problems of grouping digital art with NFT art in a blanket way. So I'm absolutely thrilled to bring this panel together. Really, it's such an honor. Today we have with us Auriea Harvey, Cole Root, the director of the Mullican estate, Dmitri Cerniak, Lauren Lee McCarthy, Rafaël Rozendaal, and Peter Burr. And we have an excellent moderator with us today, Tina Rivers Ryan. Now, I'm sure all of these artists and Tina need no introduction, but we will start with reviewing their artworks that are featured in A2P and Rafaël 1.0. So I just first of all want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you to all the artists for being here, and to Tina as well for making time in the midst of travel to celebrate the retrospective with us. So we'll start with A2P and then work our way to the most recent exhibitions. So Casey, if you don't mind pulling up Peter Burr's Mode Confusion. Now, Mode Confusion is an animated GIF from A2P 2019, curated by Casey Reas, Addie Wagenknecht, Silva, and exonemo. So Peter, if you want to say a bit about this piece, we'd love to hear a bit about it.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. It's really an honor to be part of this group. Gosh, what to say about Mode Confusion? Technically, this is a piece that emerged from a bunch of projects that I was developing in a game engine. So I was playing around with crowd systems and how to simulate life on these abstract structures. And this was a time when I was entering Zoom mode quite fervently. I was teaching a lot, and I suppose these tools that I was playing around with became a mode for kind of catharsis to try to explore like what the state is that we're in, and hopefully trying to find a way to resonate with other people who are in that state as well.
Thank you. Next, we have Auriea Harvey, whose piece Sketch for a Cyclops appeared in A2P, once again curated by Casey, Addie, Rick, and exonemo. Auriea, do you want to say a bit about this piece?
Yeah, so this, in the original A2P, I wanted to mint a 3D model That was the thing that I asked Casey about, which wasn't exactly possible at that moment, at that point in time in 2019 to do so. And so I was just like, lame, this stuff is useless. But at the same time, I found a way of making it work in that I put this QR code there, which probably still works and probably leads to a page on my web server where I offered the file for download with a file that you could 3D print, because that was what I was interested in doing, but I had no idea how to do that. It was very soon after I had wound down my video game studio and I was turning to 3D as a way to create sculpture in all kinds of ways, both purely virtual and in physical. So I don't know if we're going to talk about the other piece that I have in the FF1, but then I can pick up the story about it then. This particular.
We can move to it. Perfect.
Well, that particular form actually went on to become a very large physical sculpture. And everything, this particular form, however, was, if you fast forward to the time of Feral File, my solo show on Feral File, Gray Matter, was a series of such 3D models, actually, because this was possible by this time. And so, and I was willing to really push this notion of what a digital sculpture as an NFT, as a downloadable 3D printable file was, and talk about the status of these sorts of objects in the virtual, the half real, and also in the physical world. And so, the two forms themselves, though, are really sort of, it's really funny that the first thing I minted was the Cyclops, and this one being a lot more of an abstraction. And yeah, I don't know, they're both themes are very current, are very strong in all of my sculpture work that I've made since 2017. So it's just really fun that both of these things are reflected in the history of Feral File. Yeah.
That's amazing. And we're so honored. It's a nice little through line. Appreciate that. Next, Dmitri Cerniak, his piece Transparent Grit is from Social Codes, the very first exhibition on Feral File, curated by Casey Reas in March 2021. Dmitri, do you want to tell us a bit about this piece?
Yeah, sure. Social Codes was all about people sharing code online kind of through social media. And I think that Transparent Grit was kind of symbolized a lot of that for me. A lot of what I was doing was like basically forcing myself to make work every single day for a period of years, but especially during the pandemic and the lockdown. And it was kind of like this same time sharing all my work. It was very like kind of transparent, my process, but at the same time, it took a lot of grit. And so I don't know. I thought it was a nice piece for the Social Codes context. And I actually kind of focus on making kind of like static imagery from systems. So this was kind of the first time that I shared something moving. So if you look at the actual image for the piece, it's kind of like an idea of how I imagined it, but I was actually showing the software. So it was much more kind of sharing what my view is as the artist. And you can scroll in and zoom and move it around with your mouse also. So if you zoom in, you get kind of like bigger images, and each time it's randomized. And so actually it was kind of the first time I guess I shared a software system as a piece of art directly like that. And I got a lot of good feedback, I think, and it was just a really important time, I think, for a lot of the artists that I worked with online and a lot of the artists that were in this show as well.
Thank you. I didn't know the connection between the context of the title and of the piece, so I'm really glad to hear it, and it is deeply poetic. So thank you so much for sharing. Next, we'll move on to Lauren Lee McCarthy with What Do You Want Me to Say? This is from Instructions Follow, curated by Paul Wilder. And this debuted in September 2019, and it was the 5th exhibition on Feral File. Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Hey, it's nice to be here. So this piece was also kind of made in the depths of the pandemic, and it was sort of responding to my exhaustion of just being on Zoom every day, and also holding some positions within my institution where I was kind of responsible for managing a lot of people's grievances and feelings at a time when it was very high stress. And so basically I got kind of exhausted just being on these calls. So I made a clone of my voice to replace me. And I found that it kind of like allowed me to puppet myself. So I could just like type things and then hear myself speak them without actually having to say them. So sometimes I'd actually sit on Zoom and just like type things and have this voice speak for me. And so in this piece, it basically asks, it asks the viewer, what do you want me to say in my voice? And then the viewer says whatever they want to hear me say, and then my voice repeats it back to them. And then it just continues in a loop like this. So I was kind of thinking on one hand about the way that all of our data and our voices and aspects of our identity are being kind of captured by different tech companies and repurposed to generate new content. And then also about the, I suppose, the emotional labor that I felt was expected of me, and I think is expected of especially women and femme and people of color, especially during the kind of 2020, 2021 times when there was just like so much happening socially and politically. So it was kind of a expression of exhaustion, but also trying to like play with that and say like, okay, can I be the master of my own voice here and sell it to you perhaps?
Thank you. You know, it's a little ironic that we're here on Zoom and you're presenting it, but I guess inspiring things really can come from Zoom fatigue. So thank you. Next, we'll go with Rafaël Rozendaal. Hi. Rafael's piece, Infinite Entropy 2, is from the show Infinite Entropy, which is Rafael's solo show in March 2022, and it was the 14th exhibition on Ferrophile. How you doing, Rafaël?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. Nice to see everyone. Infinite Entropy is, all my works are very simple rules and diagrams that come from drawing. So it all starts with a pen on paper and thinking about composition. And most of the time my work has a hard edge character of clear areas that make sense on a computer. In this case, this piece was a little different than my other works, and that's why I felt it was good to do it on Ferrophile. So it's still, the way it's built, they're just circles that go from one color to the other, and they move from the center outward. But because I'm working with transparency, it may be similar to Dmitri's piece, that there's a similarity. They're just circles moving from the inside out, but because of the transparency, you get this kind of dreamy, less graspable structure. I think most of my works, it's very easy to see what I'm doing. It's like you cut it in half, you cut it in half again. And here there's a lot going on. And one aspect that I liked about Ferrophile is that we were able to make code-based works that run in the browser, that we didn't have to convert it to video, because this piece is a nightmare for any video compression. So it's really a software piece. It's something that now people are seeing through Zoom, and I always think Zoom is a terrible platform for digital art, but we use what we have. But I've always had this interest in code. Is this very simple way of making things, and it's all about clear thinking and making systems. And then once it goes to video, you go from a 3 kilobyte file to a 12 gigabyte file of lesser quality. So that's part of my working process. To summarize, it's quite a different piece from my other works, and that's why I felt like it was good as a single statement on Ferrophile.
Thank you so much. Next, back to Peter Burr with Power Plant. Power Plant is from Boomtown, Peter's solo show on Ferrophile, in exhibition number 25.
Yeah, gosh, what can I say about this project? This was, but perhaps we can kind of get into these larger conversations about what NFTs are and what their specific affordances are in the larger consideration of digital art. But I like to often think about architecture. Michael Sorkin, who's this architecture critic who actually unfortunately died during the COVID pandemic, talked about how architecture is this thing that's produced at the intersection of art and property. And so it's it's this really interesting kind of form that really legibly records the history of communal life because of that. And so I think about NFTs and their, I think the way that they are so deeply tied to property ownership. And so with this project Boomtown, I was thinking about how I could create an artwork that is a city. I was thinking a lot about SimCity and Mac Paint, the first two, some of the early video games that I played that were also kind of secretly training me to be a digital artist. And this project is built to last for a decade. On the first day of the show, people bought these mint condition, pristine buildings, and over the course of its lifetime, it slowly ages as the Ethereum blockchain grows. And so what we're seeing here is a sneak peek of the power plant as it'll probably look in a few years.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Cole Root from the Lee Mullican estate. And Lee Mullican, the piece here is lmsp7.pcx, and this is from leemullican.pcx, an exhibition curated by Annika Meyer in March 2023. And it was the 29th exhibition on Feralfile. Hi, Cole.
Hi, hello everyone. Our project's a little different from everyone else's, being a historic digital art project coming to blockchain. Lee made these works while teaching at UCLA. He made them between 1987 and 1989. The .pcx show reflects the earliest works that Lee made in 1987. And it's, as an estate, it's really part of our job to take the assets we have in the artwork and steward legacy for Lee and his wife Luchita, and figure out how to recontextualize their work and make it interesting to new audiences. And that Feralfile show gave us the opportunity to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cole. And once again, thank you all so much for being here with us today. I very gladly now pass it over to Tina Rivers Ryan, who curated Peer to Peer, an exhibition in partnership with Buffalo AKG, which debuted in December of 2022. And just to let you know, we're going to leave about 5 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A section now or throughout the conversation. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Tina, who, let me just say, the piece featured from Peer to Peer is Club Rothko by La Turbo Avedon. And Casey's showing it here right now. But thank you so much, Tina, for moderating. How are you?
Yeah, great. So happy to be in conversation with Feralfile again and with all of these incredible artists, some of whom I have worked with directly, some of whom I am going to work with in upcoming exhibitions, and everybody else I hope to work with at some point. You guys are all really inspirational. Okay, digital art versus NFTs. So I said this earlier as we were all sort of starting to gather together. I went back on my Twitter and I searched for instances in which I was talking about blockchain art, crypto art, NFT art. And the most recent one I found was me basically saying, I can't have this conversation again. I've been talking about this for 2 years, I'm out. And yet here we are still having this conversation about what is the what, right? It's a question of nomenclature. It's also a question of ontology. So what are we talking about and how do we name what we're talking about? And on the one hand, I feel like this conversation is kind of a bit silly. As Shakespeare said, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, right? Art, regardless of what you want to call it, is going to be art. It's going to do its thing. And yet we do have a need, I think, to name things in order to sort of create a common ground, right? For conversation, for dialogue. Certainly as a curator, an art historian, and a critic, we need to name things, we need taxonomies in order to sort of make sense of the chaos, right? And so this is like something that might actually be fundamentally at odds with the NFT space, right? It's like no gatekeeping, no gods, no masters. And yet the idea of naming things is so that we can make sense of them, categorize, make judgments, and basically produce history, right? Let me just start this conversation by saying that I'm taking it as a given that names are important and that we must use them, but I'm willing to sort of allow that not everyone might agree with that premise, and maybe that's something we can get into. I'm also very I don't know if I want to say intimidated to be having this conversation with artists, because I feel like I have yet to meet an artist who agrees with any label that's ever been assigned to them. I feel like you guys don't like to be labeled. You don't like to be put in boxes. And so no matter what name we use, it's always sort of wrong. I've talked to artists who I think of as glitch artists who are like, don't call me a glitch artist, right? Or I've talked to artists who I think of as net artists, like, don't call me a net artist. So anyway, so we'll see. I'm interested to see sort of how you guys feel about these labels being applied to you. Another thing I wanted to get into just as a sort of preamble before we start this conversation is to point out that in some sense, the NFT space is inheriting a problem that is much older, which is that we've always struggled with how we talk about art made with computers, right? So just to go over some of the many names that this field has gone by, in the 1960s, it was called computer art. A couple decades in, we started using the term digital art. We also saw the use of new media art to describe works that were made with new media, which was a term that emerged in the 90s to distinguish between the old media of printed journalism and broadcast television. So in a commercial sense, so new media art. Then we saw variable media art. Then we saw time-based media art, which was sort of to distinguish from, or to distinguish between sort of time-based work that is performative and durational, and maybe something like photography, which could be thought of as a kind of media art in the sense that it's made with a media technology. And then that all sort of got boiled down, like time-based media, variable media, into just media art. So, you know, this is a problem that's been going on for a really long time, since before NFTs came along. And now that we have NFTs, I just wanted to throw out some of the terms that I've heard used to describe various artists' practices in this field. And I also mentioned earlier before we got started that I had started to try to make an alignment chart of these names, but decided that it's like actually too chaotic to try to sort of identify any, to put things in their boxes. But maybe at one end, we can say we have something called digital collectibles. And at another end, we have something called art. And somewhere in between these things, we have crypto art, NFT art, blockchain art, on-chain art, tokenized art, maybe generative art, and then digital art, right? So digital collectibles, art, and then a whole host of other terms in between. So I think that in a sense, the way I interpreted the title of this panel as Rafaël coined it, you know, digital art versus NFT art, I thought of it as a question of, you know, which word are we going to use? And I thought it was very interesting that in her introduction, Elizabeth kept using the term digital art, and many of you also kept using the term digital art. And so I feel like maybe this question has been solved, and maybe we're just all comfortable with using digital art to talk about what we want to talk about, and like we're done and we can just move into Q&A. But then I started thinking that, you know, implied there in that verses is also antagonism, right? And so I think we're also picking up on the problem of what to call it. You know, it's not just a purely academic question. We're also talking about different communities of artists that now increasingly are emerging or overlapping, but at first were not. We're talking about maybe different relationship to the idea of property. We're talking about a different relationship to the internet, to, you know, Web 2 versus Web 3 models, to ideas of decentralization, et cetera. So yeah, so this framing of digital art versus NFT art, one of the things that's really difficult, I think, in talking about, you know, NFTs, and this was also true in a sense with digital art, is that it was always unclear whether you're talking about a tool, a medium, a stylistic movement, or a technology, or a community, right? And so, as always, I think terms are meaningless unless we continually define and redefine them. And which is why we're here today, and why after 2 years of having this debate, I was like, I can't do it anymore, right? Because it's like how people identify and what these terms mean, it always just depends on it, like it just iterates, right? It's very performative in the way that I guess all of this art made with computers is, to use the most neutral term imaginable, perhaps. Although, of course, there's a question, can you make digital art without computers? And I would actually argue yes, but that's because I am chaotic. So all right, so now I want to, with that sort of like framing of the conversation, I want to kick it over to you guys. And I want to start with a really boring question, but hopefully it will open up into a good conversation, which is, how do you identify? Because as a curator, a historian, you know, I always think it's important to respect the artist and how they frame their work, and not to say that I don't also reserve my own right to, and not just right, but responsibility actually to contextualize what you guys are doing and to put a name on it. But I always like to start with what you guys think. So what would you call yourselves? And let's see if we can come to some type of quorum, or if we have as many different answers as we do artists and representatives of artists on the stage.
Lawful neutral?
I'll take chaotic neutral.
Okay, are we going to map lawful neutral and chaotic neutral onto any terms, or are we just going to let people use their imagination?
Well,
Hey, I was waiting for years for digital art to come back into vogue, actually. During this whole new media art phase, digital art fell out of fashion. You couldn't say you were a digital artist or without sounding completely corny. As soon as it came back, I was like, yes, we're back. So yeah, digital art's fine. Although I don't define what I do just as that though, because obviously I just go, I'm a sculptor, because that helps me make a bridge to a different kind of community. So yeah.
If I can, I wanted to break something down, that if you say you're a painter, you're not necessarily an artist. You could be a house painter or an illustrator, but it's a craft. And so you say I'm a painter, that's kind of easy to say. But to say I'm an artist is like giving yourself a compliment. They say, I'm a genius. Like if you say this chef is so good, it's better than anything you've ever tasted, he or she is an artist. And so the term artist is often used in instead of the word genius. So it becomes really weird to say I'm an artist. And especially if you didn't come from art school and you're doing stuff on the internet and it starts kind of spontaneous, and then you're like, I'm an artist. And people are like, really? So it's like saying I'm a poet, and people are like, I read your poems, they're not that good, you're not a poet. So I think that's what's holding back a lot of people. It's scary to say you're an artist, but of course everyone wants to be in the main category, not in the subcategory.
So then would the analog be saying basically something like I'm a coder, to saying like I'm a painter rather than saying I'm an artist? But then that immediately raises other questions, because not everybody who makes digital art interacts with computers at the level of code, right? Like not everyone is actually making code, creating code, right? Some people are, you know, interfacing at the level of software. So would those people be called coders?
For us, that's what I think we use the terms that we have from Lee used from his notes. So we kind of think of it as Lee's work as computer art, because that was his position. He was not related to code or computer science at all. He was a painter who started making digital work whenever it became user friendly enough for him to be able to make, he called them digital paintings and drawings, or computer paintings or drawings. So yeah.
I guess I would kind of riffing off what Rafaël mentioned, like generally when I meet people and they ask me what I do, I say I make art. And then they say, oh, what kind of art do you make? And then I say, I make art with code. And then I have to kind of give some more context into that. But I agree, it's tricky to jump into any kind of specific term. Like, maybe a few years ago, I would introduce the idea of generative art and say like, I do generative art, but I feel like the term generative art, you can basically include almost anything in that. Like if you take an academic standpoint, especially, like you could have a generative system. And so for me, I am particularly focused on the idea of automation as an artistic medium using code, because I think for me, that is, a technological, like you have a group of creative people who have forced to become more technical in the world that we live in, and they are expressing themselves through that coding and through that kind of like automative tool. And I think that's how I like to think about it.
This just like reminds me though of something that I didn't mention in my preamble, which is already too long, which is that it is very weird that we have this kind of obsession with naming artists who work with computers, with identifying them according to their tools, right? Like in the 20th century, high modernism, there was this idea that, You know, you could be a painter or a sculptor or a printmaker or a photographer, and that your work had to engage with the affordances and limitations of your medium, which in some sense was reducible to a technical substrate, like literally, what are the physical materials that you work with, right? And then postmodernism came and blew that out of the water. And then we no longer were identifying artists exclusively by like the physical materials that they worked with, right? And it no longer really made so much sense to always pigeonhole people into saying, well, they're a painter or they're a printmaker or they're a sculptor, because you had artists, like I'm just going to throw out one person right here who's a prominent artist in our collection. So I'm a curator at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum. We own, we were bequeathed the estate of the artist Marisol, who was a pop artist in the 1960s. And so we have thousands of objects by Marisol. And she's known as a sculptor, but we also have beautiful drawings in pastel and also in pencil. We have photographs that she took, right? So it's like, well, how do we even talk about Marisol? And so this is what I mean by we sort of left this moment behind of saying that somebody was exclusively working in one medium. And yet along comes digital technology, and suddenly we're back to this like pre-postmodernist idea that you must be pigeonholed according to your tools. And this is actually something that I think Lev Manovich first pointed out a couple of decades ago. And then Domenico Quaranta has also written about in his work on sort of post-media art. So yeah, does it feel anachronistic to you guys to have to now be referred to as, you know, or to be identified according to the tools that you use? Do you just want to be artists in the same way that contemporary artists now just to get to be artists? Or does it feel important to hold on to the specificity of the fact that you guys are using computers and that that's a really meaningful part of your practice, right? So is being associated with computers, is that too sort of narrowing, or is that actually conceptually really important?
And I mean, for me, I'll accept any label you want to give me. Like I can be anything you want me to be. The label I most
Currently McCarthy, sorry, I just have to say that.
I most identify or relate to the term like performance artist, but I am working with code. But I'm really interested actually in how there's different audiences and you reach different people depending on the different kind of framings or areas you might find yourself in, whether that's like film or code art or performance or journalism or whatever. So I'm really interested in how your identity as an artist can actually kind of like fluidly move between those.
Yeah, it's something that you said. Sorry, go ahead, Rafaël.
Go ahead. Yeah. Well, in around 2008, 2009, I was in Berlin, and everybody started with net art. And then there was a clear moment where everybody said, no, I don't want to be labeled as a net artist. I'm a contemporary artist. People said, and I don't want to be in internet group shows. And I was like, I love the internet. Galleries take too much of a role in defining us, and the internet's more about independence. So that's why, to me, the internet it's not a formal medium, but it's an attitude that you're like, I'm not going to wait around, but I'm going to do something myself. So if something says, I'm a generative artist or blockchain artist or an influencer, I always think Warhol is the best example. You don't think of him as a technological artist, but he would use any technology. And that to me is the best. If you can reach that level where you're just like, he's Warhol, he's visionary. It's not a painter or whatever.
And Warhol was very good at letting other people define what sort of niche he fit in. I mean, something that you mentioned early on in your preamble, Tina, is just the social component. Like, I think it is important to think about the social histories of the mediums. That these aren't just technical spaces; they're also social spaces. And so, this idea of being an NFT artist, I'm in a video game culture quite frequently, and when I invoke this term, I'm picking a fight. It's just kind of part of what happens within these communities that I'm a part of people that have specific ideas about what that term means that are perhaps different than folks that are in this space. And so, I mean, to kind of platform something that Chris Coleman put in the chat in response to Rafaël talking about the broadness of art, or the pretentiousness perhaps of that, of the Vasilkas claiming that only other people can call themselves artists. I do think that there's something valuable about allowing these definitions to be open and to pay attention to the environment, the social ecosystem that we're a part of, and to think about how our work actually fits into that and how it operates.
So I have a question for you guys, inspired by what Lorna Mills just put into the chat. Although first, I just do briefly want to point out that Warhol's also an interesting person to cite here, because there is one term that Warhol did invent and claim for himself, and that is he being a business artist, which seems incredibly relevant to the NFT space. Anyway, so Lorna points out that in a panel on digital art at the Whitney a few years ago, Brian Jacques pointed out that the problem with talking about a given work is that it requires a long preamble about what it actually is or how it's made. And so I wonder, I think that's true, right? It's something that I've been railing against. I've in print recently, like for a reflection I wrote for the Brooklyn Rail on what word I want to see more of or less of in conversations around art and technology. I said, I want to see more of a conversation around aesthetics, because I feel like we have, you know, in this conjunction of art and technology, we meaning perhaps the traditional art world, that's who I'll speak on behalf of, became so focused on the technology, so fetishized on the technology, because that was the foreign part that we didn't understand, that all of the conversations around this work tends to surface, you know, the algorithm, the code, and sort of we've lost track of the aesthetics of it. And so, yeah, I think it's true. And part of it is because, as I said, that is the unfamiliar part. That's the part that many of us, you know, who were trained or studied in art history don't have a handle on. And so before, you know, we can talk about, and I could use any of your works as an example here, but before we could talk about any of these works, it's like, we need to just explain, like, what is the what, right? It's like, well, what's going on here? And so my question for you guys is, what do you think happens 25 years from now, where we have a new generation of people who maybe, hopefully, and this is debatable because we know what happened with like the introduction of like black boxing, where like now we have actually digital natives who don't understand things like file architecture, for example. But like, you know, what happens if we do have a new generation of people who do have a more intuitive understanding of computer technology? Will it still be as important to hold on to sort of saying, you know, well, this is made in this digital way and this is what it is? So, and I'll give one concrete example of this. Trying to figure out medium lines for Aurea's work in our collection, right? So like, what is the what? And I basically argued that we need to make it analogous to how we describe photography in our collection, because in our collection, the medium line does not say photograph. The medium line says gelatin silver print, right? And so I said that analogously, and we can do that because at this point, if you are on our website looking at our medium lines, you're probably somebody who's so into art that you understand the difference between a gelatin silver print and a chromogenic print, right? Or a you know, salt paper print or whatever. That those things mean something to enough people in the art world that it's worth making those distinctions. And so I was arguing that analogously, I'm not going to describe Aurea's work as augmented reality model. That's like calling it photograph, right? I'm like, you need to dig in and have more specificity, because I think in the future, I'm hoping we don't need to use such generic blanket terms as augmented reality. We can actually say, like, you know, what kind of file this is, right? That actually means something, or like, you know, what kind of, like, is this, you know, Unreal Engine or is it Unity? Like, that's gonna, maybe there'll be a new generation of people who will understand that, and then we won't need these big high level terms like augmented reality. But what do you guys think?
I have a pretty good example that I think you'll appreciate. So I spent a lot of my time actually fighting auction houses to describe my work as basically JavaScript rendered in the browser, like on a canvas, or SVG created. But because that's conceptually underlying how the actual work is generated, but then on an NFT token, it's actually like an image that's generated. And so it links to this image. And so they're saying, no, it's a PNG 2000 pixels by 2000 pixels. And I spent like hours and hours, like basically just arguing with them. And because technically on like that token standard, it's this image, but that isn't the medium of the artwork at all. And I didn't get, like, I think I didn't get anywhere on it. And so like that, I just thought that was like an interesting example of where the NFT starts to interfere with like, what is the actual medium of this artwork, even when the artist is telling you this straight up, like, this is incorrect.
Well, but this gets on something we haven't even talked about yet, which is the confusion between the token and the art, right? That in some instances, and I've said this a million times, so, maybe everybody already knows this, but right, in some instances, the artwork is on chain or it is relational. It's about transactions between wallets. It's wallet art, actually, oh my God, is another term we can put on our alignment chart that I forgot to mention, right? So in some instances, yes, but in many instances, we're using the token to financially transact, to render scarce, to render as property, a work that actually is not on chain at all, right? And yet there is the shorthand when we say, I bought this work, what we mean is we bought the NFT that symbolically represents property rights in that work, right? So yeah, that doesn't help matters at all. And so this is why another term, and I forget, did I mention this in my alignment chart? The term that I like using is actually tokenized art for those cases, right? To explain that it is an artwork that happens to have been tokenized to facilitate its, transactability or something. But I know that there are some artists who, even though they don't make on-chain art, they do feel like the fact that they make their art into tokens, that they use NFTs, is actually an important part of their practice. And so we've had to decide as a museum, like, would we describe, like, say somebody has a JPEG file, right? Like, is the medium line, I would argue it would be like JPEG, but there are some artists who tokenize their JPEGs who really want it to be like NFT, right? And so then that opens up a whole other can of worms. So I've tried to hit a compromise and say, well, it's a tokenized JPEG.
But I think this gets back to, okay, let's get back to, you asked several questions here, but I think it gets back to a bit of what Rafaël was saying about the specificity of and the context and the attitude around each of those labels, because somebody wants it called NFT art because it speaks of a certain time, a certain attitude, a certain lifestyle, if you will, for some, and maybe it's that same thing where Peter's talking about, if he's among gamers and he says NFT, then that he's picking a fight. Those people are like in that fight, if you know what I'm saying, and that's why they want to say it's NFT art. So I feel for you as someone who runs a museum, but context matters. I mean, big time, and that matters to most artists, actually, because if you talk about what's going to happen in 25 years, what's really going to happen is the context is going to change. And so what do you want people to know about what you made in terms of that? Do you care? It's like, I'm at a point in my life where I don't care. It's like, I just want it called sculpture and let's have done with it, and I want people, so it's like, often I want the opposite of all of this. I want to call it something blanket and simple like sculpture and have people accept what I do as sculpture, which is sometimes asking a lot. I'm asking you to look at my NFT and think sculpture, and not think about NFTs and not think about the digitality of it necessarily. And so in the future, 25 years from now, I'm hoping they just go, oh yeah, she made this sculpture. Boom. It's like, and for me, that makes everything all nice and clean and simple and wonderful. But at first I must invent the world in which this can be true. So therefore I use NFTs to do that. And yeah, it's a complicated world we live in, and you're not going to get one answer.
Maybe something we can also add to make it even more complicated is that NFTs by nature are public works, and museums are public institutions, or public facing at least. And so you're collecting a work and harboring it in the museum and exhibiting it in the museum, but it's also visible everywhere at the same time. So I don't know if there's a term for that when you label a work that says you're looking at it here, but it also exists everywhere at the same time.
Well, I mean, this is a whole nother can of worms. I would say it's no different than museums that deal with popular culture, right? That, become kind of anthropological in nature. But yeah, I wanted to ask you guys actually about the relationship to art history. And do you feel like having a title like digital art or blockchain art, I mean, on the one hand, at least the word art is in there. but it could seem that by foregrounding digital or blockchain first, that it's sort of, you know, isolating you as not being in conversation with, for example, the history of sculpture, right? It makes it seem like, well, this is about digital stuff, and digital stuff sounds very different than sculpture, which sounds different than painting, right? On the other hand, you know, art history, as it has historically been written, is a sort of march of one ism to the next. And if you go back, the fact is, you know, we use names like Impressionism and Cubism in order to name sort of chapters of that narrative. And the artists never liked those terms, right? I mean, like, I like to point out that both Impressionism and Cubism were terms invented by critics that were supposed to be insulting. They were both epithets, like they were sarcastic descriptions of the art, not terms that were generated by the artists. So in a sense, artists have like never really had control, not never, but, you know, we apply these terms either, sort of as insults or, in many cases, way after the fact, right? Like way after the fact. It's only really in the 20th century with this invention of like, we must be radical, we must be new, we're going to write a manifesto, that you have the rise of people who take on the mantle of calling themselves like, well, we are the futurists, you know? But in many cases, that's not how it works. So do you feel like it's even the responsibility of artists to come up with these terms, or are you happy to leave it to the critics and historians?
And how does this relate to Lee Mullican's work? Sorry to jump in here, but I'm just really curious because, you know, was a painter and created these digital paintings, but at the same time, it's like, it sort of recategorizes his work in a way, don't you think, or no?
In ways, I guess it's like a lot of times he was using the same methodology and kind of in his paintings as his digital work, and kind of adapting the technology to his physical practice. Lee's painting, his kind of big breakthrough was in the 40s, where he started using the palette knife to make marks, three-dimensional raised lines on his paintings called striations. And even the work behind me, you can kind of see these like raised lines throughout the work. It's like linear kind of narrative, and also the way it's kind of playing between representational and abstraction. So I wouldn't say that it changed. It was just a new tool for him to make the work that he'd been pursuing. And throughout Lee's life, he was doing, he did kind of every kind of art that he could, painting and drawing, but then sculpture. He was always trying to find a way to take painting somewhere else. He started making these painted wooden sculptures, a way to take painting off the wall. He started making works in clay and bronze, and was always just working. He was also a writer too, and photographer. So.
But would you say recontextualizing these works as NFTs changes them at all, or how?
No, because I guess to go back to kind of what everyone was talking about a moment ago, particularly with things like how we define the work, you know, I kind of veer towards the tokenized art phrasing because, and to historically contextualize them and process, that's why with the titles we use the original file extensions, because it's kind of a way to reference back to these defunct programs. For Lee particularly, you know, these file types aren't supported by web browsers or barely open. You know, they open in a modified, the PCX files particularly open in a weird compressed mode that we had to use analog documentation to make sure they're right in the correct aspect ratio. So also for us, I look at the NFT as a tool and sales mechanism, and it's really important for me that the original file in its original format is downloadable content. So with our Feral Files show, like it's all the original untouched PCX files from, you know, 87 or whatever are downloadable. And to me, that is the work, is the downloadable file. And what you're seeing as a, you know, we have to convert it to a JPEG to make the NFT, because that's, you know, the TGA or PCX files aren't supported by any web browser. So there's a lot there to unpack for people that want to get into it. And with our Feral Files show, I did like post a lot of things on Twitter talking about the software that Lee was making, which is very rudimentary, like early paint shop kind of software. But it gives people that want to dig into that history an opportunity to do
it. So we're down to the last 8 minutes. So I do want to tackle, there was one question that was posed in the Q&A by Clemens that I do want to throw out to the group. So They write, I feel like digital art has recently lost its radicalism. It's starting to feel repetitive. What are your thoughts on this?
I remember around 2000, 1999, I was talking to a friend and I was like, I'm worried about repeating myself. And he's like, I'd made 4 works or something and I wanted every work. And he's like, name one good artist who isn't repetitive. And I was like, oh yeah, you have a point.
I think
I think I can't, any artist I like is repetitive, even Duchamp.
I think that in kind of the genre that I'm interested in, you have this basically inflow of people who are interested in the form, particularly over the past few years. And there's a lot of kind of basic visual algorithms that you learn, and I don't think they necessarily stand out as art, but you have a lot of people getting into this and they're using these kind of forms and learning about structure and composition. And so that can look repetitive across a set of artists, but then you start to see the people, I think, who've been doing this for a while, and they have a lot of nuance and detail and understanding, and that's where like things start to stand out. So I think that in this kind of like generative art or space right now, you do have a lot of stuff that looks repetitive just because people are learning the basic building blocks or ideas. But over time, with effort, it will get a lot better. And I think just in this particular niche, you just have so many people who've gotten into it over the past few years, particularly just because now there's like a pathway to be a full-time artist because the economics have changed so drastically.
And on the topic of like radicalism too, I mean, these definitions are always changing. And I find myself, when I'm getting bored of something or I'm finding it to be too conservative, looking at different context. I mean, maybe digital art as it's thought of in this moment is feeling a bit repetitive and conservative. So what happens if you look at something digital that's not called art, or something that's art that's not digital? I think there's a lot of ways to sort of rearrange our sense of what the boundaries of these worlds are that can start getting us towards things that are much more radical. I'm excited about things that are not art when I'm interested in gestures towards living a more radical life.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that. I mean, going back to your point, Tina, about like, should artists be responsible for naming things? Should that be up to the, critics and institutions? I think generally there's a conservatism in the market and in arts institutions. And so I think it's really important for artists to write their own history and to define things on their own terms, especially for artists that are more marginalized or underrepresented, because they'll otherwise just be totally ignored in that history, or maybe resurface, 50 years later or something. But I think the idea that we can just rely on these terms that are or labels that are given works for some people, but not for others. And if we really want to see things that are radical or pushing boundaries, those are particularly the spaces where I think artists have to be kind of defining their own parameters and their own ways of talking about what they're doing.
Lauren, it's such a good point that my laptop just almost fell off the table. Yes, and I'd also want to point something out, and I'm extrapolating here from my work as an art historian, but I think it applies. When I was in graduate school and starting to write about art and technology, I had a lot of anxiety about how to market myself in academia. It's like, am I a contemporary art person? Am I like a science and technology studies person? Am I like a film and new media person? What am I? And my advisor said to me, and I'll never forget this, do good work, just do good work, and you'll make your own field, And I think that for when I now as a curator, historian, critic, look out at artists, it's like sometimes, I don't want to say exclusively, but a lot of the most exciting projects are actually those that exist in the margins that aren't nameable yet, right? And that what those projects do is that they will actually make a field in their wake, right? Like we will have to invent new language in order to describe what they're doing. So I guess what I'm trying to say is not everything needs to be legible at the moment of its release, right? And sometimes the legibility is only something that emerges after the fact. But ideally, artists should be part of that process, would be my opinion. So there's one other thing that got pointed out that I want to call on that actually just relates to something that I think Lauren was just talking about, which is that Lee points out, is it safe to assume that some of the agency is negotiated when looking for or applying for funding where categories are set by an external panel? And so I just wanted to use that as an excuse to bring up the bureaucratic dimension of this, that also sometimes these labels exist or are important only insofar as an artist is trying to interface with the structure of power, right? Whether it's a funding agency or a collecting museum or a for-profit gallery, it's like, how do I name myself so that my work does become legible within these bureaucracies, right? Like within these structures. If you look historically, it's like, you know, the National Endowment for the Arts, for example, like their grants programs, like, you know, if you look at the way they describe the program that gives money to artists who work with media has changed, right? And how, like, you know, like the emphasis was on film, and now they're trying to focus more on artists who make digital work. FYI, you guys should all look into their grants programs. Just recognizing that in a certain sense, this act of naming is directly a function of the sort of exercise of power by institutions that, you know, are bureaucracies, and that so perhaps one needs to take them with a grain of salt, I guess would be my point there. Or an academic, Tali from Lovid is pointing out, or an academic institution. Exactly. It's like, you don't know what kind of artist you are until you go on the job market and try to make a case that you should be a professor of so-and-so, right? All right, so we're pretty much at the hour. So this has actually been a way more fun and insightful conversation than I thought any conversation on this topic could be at the year of our Lord 2023. So thank you all so much, including you in the audience. I am going to put everyone on the hot seat right now. We're going to go around and everyone's going to have to tell me in one word, what would you want me to label your art as? Okay, so Aurea's already gone and has said sculptor. So you're good. Okay, but everyone else needs to go around in your hot seat. Gun to your head, proverbially speaking. What kind of artist are you? Peter, you're unmuted.
Tina, so harsh. Since we can only choose one word, I guess I'll choose the thing I'm excited about right now. I'll say simulation.
Am I gonna have to call on people? Okay, Dmitri.
I think for me, when it comes down to it, it's just kind of, it's automation. It's like the idea of using tools to explore the visual like space or ideas, and ultimately there's outputs. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but to me, that's like the idea of automation as a creative force is something that I'm just, I don't know, fascinated with.
Lauren. Performance?
Yeah, performance, you know, the performance we're doing with each other, for each other, with the technologies that we're interacting with. I think the whole experience is very performative, and that's what I'm interested in.
Paul, do you want to go on behalf of Lee?
I will, and I guess what I would say, you know, say for Lee is spiritual, because Lee's output was a part of a meditative and spiritual practice, and that's where he was going. He was in this perpetual, you know, search for inner space, and that's what he was doing with his painting, his writing, his sculpture, everything. So I think that extends to his digital work as well.
Rafaël, I think you're last.
Yeah, I always call myself a visual artist. I think what I'm trying to do is to do things in art that can't be expressed in words. That's the goal. So I want people to see something, feel something, some energy coming without having to dress up the work with an intro, and just you're there with the work. And so that's why I say visual artist.
Okay, that was amazing. And now I'm in so much trouble because not a single one of you wants to be a digital artist. So now I have to think about, what is the framework, what is the book that we're going to have to write to be able to talk about all these practices. But I think the moral of the story is that, it's about artistic vision, right? And it's about what you guys are trying to achieve, whether it's simulation, automation, dealing with visuality, performance, sculpture as a historical medium and inherited tradition with three-dimensionality, right? It's yeah, so this is just sort of, I guess, we're landing in the place of, it's not the tool, you can't define it by the tool, right? It's about what you're doing with the tool that matters. So let that be a lesson to us all, myself included. And thank you guys all so much for being here, and to the audience as well. And thank you so much to Feralfile for inviting us and for creating this platform for us to have this conversation, which turns out to be still much needed. So thank you, Elizabeth.
Of course. Thank you all so much. This conversation has been incredible. Really, thank you all so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts. Thank you, Auriea, Cole, on behalf of Lee, Mullican, Peter, Dmitri, Rafaël, Lauren, who had to just bounce out early, and Tina. Thank you all so much. Really, this has been remarkable. And we'll be posting this recorded session online with little clips as well. So keep a lookout for that. And I'll just give a little bit of a heads up for what's coming up next in the retrospective series. So tomorrow we have a conversation with curators at 6 p.m. Eastern. And that's with Casey Reas, Christian Paul, Annika Meyer, Alex Esterick, Regina Harsoni, and Rick Silva. And then on Wednesday, we'll have our closing conversation with Casey Reas, Charlotte Kent, and Chris Coleman, along with artists featured in the retrospective. And this will be at 1 p.m. Eastern on July 12th. That will be a Twitter space. We haven't published the link yet, but just keep an eye out. It will be posted later today. And then just a little sneak peek of what's coming up next after the retrospective on the 13th. So on Thursday, we are launching our very first exhibition of Feralfile 2.0. It's called N=12, and it's with Aaron Penne. He's the curator. And it's really a phenomenal group of artists who have collaborated in the most beautiful way on this exhibition. So be sure to keep an eye out for programming and for conversations about those as well. So with that, again, thank you. Thank you so much. This conversation has been truly fascinating and a lot to take note and think about. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.